Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and to those online, thank you for joining in. Moving along with today's proceedings, we will now have the panel discussion on New Southern Policy as a Catalyst for Deepening ASEAN-ROK Relations. May I please invite the role players for this panel discussion to take their allocated seats. A reminder to those joining us today via Zoom, unless you are a role player, please turn off your camera and audio feeds during the sessions to ensure clarity for our online presenters. You may place your questions in the chat box. Dr. Hu Chiu Ping, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Harris Chair. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So welcome to our first hybrid event organized by ISIS Malaysia. So since the annual Asia Pacific Roundtable has been cancelled, so this is actually the largest in-person event that we ever have. So, and we have Korea Foundation to thank for this sponsorship and also organization and the culmination of this book launch. So for the first panel, we are going to have Ms. Frances A. Cruz joining us from Manila. So, another note is that all of the panelists here are actually book writers. So they are book chapter writers who contributed to the discussion on middle power economics and also cybersecurity. And of course, last but not least, our Ms. Falina side on cybersecurity. So all these chapters contain the part one of the book. So the initial intention to explore the multifaceted ASEAN-ROK relations is to look at how we can advance Korea's infrastructure development diplomacy. But unfortunately, because the book writers decided to withdraw from the commitment due to the chaos wreaked upon by COVID-19. So we have to reorganize the chapter in the way that it is presented now. And also joining us via Zoom is our discussant. So Dr. Lee Jae-hyun from ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies, a very good friend of ISIS Malaysia. So he has been engaged in Malaysia, Korea, track 2 via ISIS Malaysia, have been coming to Malaysia for many years. So we welcome him to be the discussant for this panel. The second discussant is Professor Andrew Yeo from Catholic University of America, so who is now currently trapped in Manila, the Philippines. So he's also joining us from Manila. Professor Andrew Yeo is a scholar on regional security architecture. He studies about ASEAN and also the dynamics involving US as a major power in East Asia. So this is a very fascinating panelist and also discussion. So we can't wait to kick off. So since this is a hybrid event, we will be having the panelists in person, and I will invite the discussant to provide their remarks for about 8 minutes, and we will also be taking questions from the floor, and Nazran would help me to get questions from the Zoom Q&A function. So so without further ado, let us begin. So our first speaker is Ms. Frances Cruz from the Philippines.
Good morning, everyone. I'll start my presentation presently, and the title of the chapter is Prospects for Soft and Middle Power Projection in the New Southern Policy. I'd like to wish a very good morning to our distinguished guests, and many thanks to the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, and the Korea Foundation for organizing this timely event and publication. I would perhaps like to preface this presentation with a short analogy related to the topic of the chapter, which may have some bearing on the nature of soft power. The analogy being that you may lead a horse to water, but not make it drink, depending on how you lead it there. meaning to say that the how is as important as the attended effects.
Francis,
such
may
as-
I request you to raise your voice a little so that the whole room can hear?
To raise my voice?
Yes,
Sorry.
that's right. Thank you.
Okay. The analogy being that you may lead a horse to water, but not make it drink, depending on how you lead it there, meaning to say the how is as important as the intended effects, and such is the nature of soft power. Here is an outline of the presentation. I'll briefly discuss some aspects of the new Southern policy that are relevant to soft power and middle powers before getting into the nitty-gritty. And then talk a bit about the middle power projection in South Korea, such as Discourses, soft power and Linkages, and its development, and reconciliating both roles in the NSP. All right, next slide. Before I get into this, soft power in South Korea, particularly in Southeast Asian states, has been felt since at least the early to mid 2000s, late 1990s to early into mid 2000s. The resulting interest in Korean culture was part of a wave of Korean pop culture that has yet to see signs of abating. Indeed, Parasite has just garnered the Best Picture in the Oscars, a first in the Anglo-centric tradition of the awards. BTS has appeared in Carpool Karaoke, and 8 years ago, Gangnam Style became the first YouTube video to reach 1 billion views. Certainly, a robust interest in Korean entertainment can be said to lead to other instances of soft power, such as an increase in interest in tourism and language learning. And I take this as kind of the starting point of this presentation. Here I discuss soft power in the context of a more encompassing framework of, sorry, could you go back, please? The first, yes. The New Southern Policy. The NSP achieves two things that are important for this chapter. First, it intends to cohesively build upon seemingly disconnected gains in ASEAN and India to wonderfully diverse areas, albeit with differing needs, capabilities, and structures of governance. Secondly, and more importantly for this presentation, is the act of consolidation. South Korea is in the midst of accumulating soft power through various initiatives in what can be read through the lens of a middle power strategy. It is thus useful for us to know to what degree these two are related, or if and how they can be made compatible. The New Southern Policy certainly endeavors to expand the range and volume of interactions between Southeast Asia and India on one hand, and South Korea on the other. Some of the initiatives that have been emphasized, for example, here in the slide, are trade volume, FDI flows, and tourism, although it is important to note that terrorism, cybersecurity, the environment, disaster management, technology, and ICT are emerging concerns that are also distributed across other aspects of the policy, which involves people, peace, and prosperity, the 3 Ps. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Considering these together, there is certainly a lot of potential. The goals are linked to foreign policy and international behavior that connects South Korea to other middle powers, which will be discussed shortly. But returning to the concept of soft power, this was originally seen as a co-optive manner of convincing other states to behave in certain ways or to develop certain preferences. It's been some time since it was developed as an idea by Joseph Nye. The resources of soft power are many, and these may include institutions, values, culture, policies, and so on. Some research centers and think tanks have endeavored to create indices for soft power, such as Monocle, which is a magazine, and Soft Power 30. And South Korea ranks, frankly, quite highly in both. These indices, for example, look at data and surveys on business and innovation, culture, government, diplomacy, and education in the case of the former, Monocle, and with the additional factor of the digital world in the latter, in the Soft Power 30. Yet seeing soft power as a combination of diplomacy, cultural and development initiatives, and economic innovation does in fact overlap with certain middle power roles. Although in a world where, next slide please. In a world where, In a world where power has been diffused greatly among several actors, so there has been a book that was released in, I think, maybe about a few years ago, about how power is then diffuse. There are many actors, not just state actors, transnational actors, etc., but even amongst states, this is true. McMahon remarks that everyone is now a kind of middle power, right? So what does this word exactly mean? A common definition of middle powers, which was developed in the 90s, suggests that they may be positional in nature, depending on the configuration of the hierarchy of states, geographic, so located in a strategic geographic position, normative, or behavioral, which involves seeking multilateral solutions. Next slide. Thank you. If we look at power indices by the Lowry Institute in Asia, which looks at diplomatic influence, defense networks, cultural influence, economic resources, military capability, and resilience, among others, South Korea ranks 6 out of 25, only behind the US, China, India, and Japan. This middle power status has, however, been, next slide, please, inconsistent with the role of South Korea, varying considerably depending on the manner of engaging bilateral partners. So it really depends on the partner, and the seeming lack of prerogative and steering capability in talks involving other powers and its own national security. Easley and Park mentioned that in contrast to perhaps traditional middle powers, there are certain factors that constrain its behavior in that regard, such as historical antecedents, economics, the pace of regionalism, or the stage of economic development. One must, however, account for the fact that one could reasonably expect consistency in evaluating a middle power role, in particular concerning Southeast Asian directed policies throughout the last few administrations in South Korea. Next slide, please. Okay, this can be found in Kim 2016, and we can see from this chart, sorry if it's a bit small for such an audience, that middle power roles have varied considerably since the early 2000s. So this is not the current administration, but we're looking here at a historical perspective. From a balancer to middle power to a reluctance to emphasize a middle power identity. In terms of ASEAN, one notices there was a focus mostly on Northeast Asian security in the 2000s until a direct security-based and multilateral approach was more obvious in the first half of the 2010s. And the emphasis on middle power, the emphasis was placed on middle power and balanced diplomacy. If we look at the chart, amongst all of these, Indonesia tends to stand out. One could also argue that Vietnam did in terms of trade. It's unclear to what degree Southeast Asia has previously configured from this kind of strategic perspective in security or general broad foreign policy goals. And this certainly would have implications for the projections for stability and continuity in terms of these this kind of relationship. We also see that there are various middle power roles. The roles of the middle power have taken on different forms, wavering between a behavioral type of middle power to emphasizing the geographic or positional nature of middle powers. In general, we see that there have been efforts to lessen US dependence at times or to emphasize a US relationship, yet somehow limited geographic focus, concentrating on the immediate Northeast Asian region and some MIKTA activities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we see that Southeast Asia and India, I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, we see that Southeast Asia and India have only been linked either economically through development aid and people-to-people relations, for instance, but have not configured into a vision of the overall security architecture, a guiding role therein, or comprehensive human security vision for the entire region of Southeast Asia and arguably also South Asia. What is also notable is that while soft power is something overwhelmingly and palpably connected to the brand of South Korea across Southeast Asia and India, and while South Korea ranks highly in Asian soft power indices, as we can see, it was only before the effects of soft power were felt which is in the 2000s, when South Korea paid much attention to Southeast Asia at all, at least strategically. Next slide, please. South Korea can, however, draw on quite a long history of soft power, which predates its recognition of the term in 2010, an official recognition, and a national branding initiative in 2009. Cultural diplomacy, for instance, can be traced back to 1968, with the merger of the Ministry of Culture and Public Information into one, since at least the 90s and early 2000s, as mentioned, was when Korean culture reached a significant audience in Southeast Asian shores. Yet we are also warned that soft power of this sort, this commercial sort, this sort that's based on entertainment and pop culture, despite having domino effects in other industries such as tourism, can be flimsy and short-lived. And we've seen this in Southeast Asia with, let's say, in the Philippines in particular, with telenovelas, or Latin American telenovelas. It is thus necessary to strengthen any gains that may have come as a result of soft power accrual to a broader set of strategies or principles that are more holistic in nature. This begs the question as to whether future extant initiatives in Southeast Asia and India are a continuation of previous economic development projects, or under one umbrella towards under one umbrella geared towards expanding markets, if it has a strategic or transformative implications for the current order, or if it even presents something novel as opposed to extant projects of other states. In addition to this is the understanding of the region. Next slide, please.
Francis, may I invite
yeah.
you to wrap up your remark in
Yep.
1 minute?
All right, I'm getting there. So there is apparently this lack of deeper understanding of diversity and what implications that has on middle powers and continuity and sustainability of soft power. All right, the last slide. Okay, so this is the last slide. Perhaps when we move into the future, we might have to take a look at some of these points to ameliorate historically weak comprehensive ties with ASEAN as a whole and recognize its diversity within ASEAN. It's quite different from, let's say, the EU. Expand from an inward-looking form of development by establishing principles in middle power initiatives, the continuity of multilateral forums and also leadership and strategic vision therein. Developing flexibility for changes in the world order as we have seen this year, and determining mutual goals and signposts between ASEAN and South Korea, and perhaps a monitoring system. In the era of diminished hegemony and leadership, South Korea will need a sustainable set of policies and a more strategic role in the South for the NSP to bear fruit. And thank you, that's it. I look forward to your comments and the discussion.
Thank you so much, Francis. So now we have Dr. Stephen Wong. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hu. I don't have a PowerPoint for you. I just have two main issues to talk about in 8 minutes. And I'll kind of go in as deep as I can, given the time allowed. The first point is this. The situational context of the New Southern Policy has changed since the time of its announcement. It has changed both situationally, the context in the region, and also it has also changed internally in terms of how the processes are being organized. This is not uncommon for when countries launch diplomatic initiatives like NSP, even BRI, when the Belt and Road Initiative, or at that time, One Belt, One Road Initiative was announced in 2013. It was a mere idea. We were all asking, where's the blueprint? And there was no blueprint. So in a sense, it kind of went on and it developed and it got into and it began to develop steam over time. And as the BRI progressed, more and more things, more and more flesh got put onto the skeleton. In fact, more skeletons got put on, more bones got put onto the skeleton. I think in the terms of the New Southern Policy, we are seeing something quite similar. From the time that it was announced, the situational context of the region at the time was quite different from where it is now. I don't have to tell you that, in terms of where the NSP sits now, in terms of the wider Asia-Pacific region, in terms of conflicts, in terms of, there are many things that we can, even COVID, maybe it will disappear, maybe it will be around, but nothing can be as dangerous. Not the virus is nothing as in the animosities that are created among nations and among people groups within nations. That in history, okay, if we talk about the number of people who have died to pandemics, who have died to disease, it's a lot, and we ought to be concerned. But far more people have health, prosperity, and lives have been lost to the animosities that nations have against other nations, that people groups have against other people groups, cultures. And I think that that situational context has changed in terms of where where we are now compared to where we were when the New Southern Policy was first announced. Although even at the time, we were already seeing some movements in that direction. So that's the broad. The second thing I want to say, or our takeaway, is this. We have to accept that the South Korea relationship with ASEAN is going to be differentiated. It's going to be pragmatic, which means that it's not going to be a collective approach between South Korea and ASEAN. Within ASEAN already, we know, in fact, as in ASEAN, we've said for well over 50 years, ASEAN, we are not the same. We are heterogeneous. We're not homogeneous. Well, I think that there is already an inkling on the part of South Korea that in dealing with ASEAN countries, it will have to be differentiated, and it will have to be based on being pragmatic. And this is only on ASEAN. There's a separate initiative that South Korea is having vis-a-vis the Mekong countries, right? I think that this is important. Why? In my chapter, I have put out 4 things. I've been a little bit naughty and asked a challenging question. Are the economics of the New Southern Policy, are they aspirational rather than real? What do I mean? Number 1, if you think that you are going to integrate merely through things like deeper and deeper free trade agreements and economic partnership agreements, etc., that is going to run its course, okay? Because that depends on economic complementarity, etc., and that will run its course. In fact, there are even problems even in the high-quality economic partnership agreements that are signed today, right? Second, if this relationship is to last any length of time, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, then you will be able to see a productivity convergence between South Korea and the ASEAN countries. And those ASEAN countries will sort of rise, okay? Third, more and more of this going forward is based on innovation and technology. And cooperation on that score is not so easy, all right? It is itself going to be a very pragmatic. If you look at, for example, South Korea's cooperation in science and technology with Singapore, and you compare that to the kind of laundry list that has been announced between South Korea and Malaysia, for example, you will see that in the case of Singapore, it is very focused, it is very specific. In our case, we have put, I think, 10 or 12 areas with very less specificity. And we are actually not that badly placed overall in terms of ASEAN, right? And then, of course, for countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, etc. So going forward, let's get it, I think, I would urge that we get this idea out of our heads that we have to do it all together or not at all. I don't think it's going to work that way, right? And I think that realization in terms of the projects that are being thought about in Seoul, in the Blue House, is already beginning, if I'm not wrong, to reflect that. Finally, we have this issue of ASEAN, and where is ASEAN itself going to be? There is an assumption implicit in the new Southern policy that ASEAN is one, and that, I mean, there's a realization that, of course, ASEAN is not one, but, you know, when you have things like commemorative summits, etc., that, you know, 2025, the ASEAN communities are going to be a reality. They're not, okay? Neither the political security, maybe the economic, but, you know, not the political security and not the socio-cultural. So the aspirational element of ASEAN Community 2025 itself is going to be contested, and therefore South Korea is going to have to deal with that. Finally, I'll come back to where I started. You know, as I reflect on this now, in this past year, the hows are not more important than the whys. I think the why is far, far more important than the hows. You know, Korean side very diligent in always asking us, you know, give us recommendations, give us proposal, all right? Tell us how to, you know, to implement the NSP. I would recommend that actually we go now, the hows will very easily present themselves. There are a lot of smart people in the room. It is the whys that are the more difficult ones, which we have to keep on engaging, given that the situational context changes, the whys have become even more important now in a world where conflict and you know, frictions are a lot more than where they were 3 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen, for your very concise, packed 3-point, and indeed within 8 minutes. So now we will have Ms. Valina.
Hello. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you greatly, Dr. Hu, for bringing together this project, and to Korea Foundation for giving the opportunity for such thoughts to be shared across regions. So my presentation actually follows on the heels of 2 great presenters and brings potential collaborations to a specific, almost granular look at possibilities for relations. Hopefully, it would actually answer the hows and the whys following Dr. Steve's recommendation for us to take a look at it. So looking at issues of cyber, we would be no stranger to it. As our current seminar, as we can see, is actually both in cyberspace as well as held physically. So South Korea is a leader in this space with internet penetration at 95%. They are home to private sectors such as Samsung and LG, as well as they hold the title of the first nation in the world to commercialize 5G. Thus, South Korea's digital maturity is justified. ASEAN's digital environment features promising statistics. So Southeast Asia has around 360 million users from about only 2/3 of the region's population, which are Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. The region's digital economy is projected to hit US 200 billion by 2025, while the e-commerce sector is expected to reach around US 88 billion. However, while Southeast Asia's online users is roughly 7 times more than Korea, approximately only 55% of the population is online. The digital divide is sharpened further by gaps in digital literacy and maturity of delivery of services through cyber. This reality was illustrated during this pandemic, when weaknesses in digital adoption impacted things like resilience, as well as supply chains and the ability for organizations to adapt to the new normal. However, as society comes online, trouble grows with cyber infrastructure becoming vulnerable to unwanted penetrations and attacks. Digital societies feature different forms of interactions. Thus, different forms of interactions also can result with different types of malicious interactions. Thus, cyberbullying, harassments become issues in a matured cyberspace. At the back of these developments is the necessity for a good infrastructure to ensure information is delivered, transactions are successful, and information that promises confidentiality, integrity, and availability would grow. Yet, would states not be concerned if information transferred to channels are compromised? While political mechanisms that uphold a rules-based order is needed, the question of capability needs to be explored, and this is where the paper actually started. which is on innovation and cybersecurity. So innovation and cybersecurity are often featured as two players pitted against each other, such as illustrations where limitations to data gathering to protect privacy is seen as inhibitors to innovation and technological growth. However, the ability to innovate, or rather the capability to produce taxi knowledge that paves the way for newer technologies, moves hand in hand with the ability for a nation to understand technology, thus the ability to prepare institutions and technical capacities. Because while a rules-based order would provide certain safeguards for nations to prevent attacks on critical infrastructure, technical capabilities strengthens the ability of institutions to provide measures needed to protect, prevent, or ensure systems come back online safely. Thus, in the paper, one of the aspects I've actually explored was on Korea's knowledge-based economy story, which started as the golden tale of manufacturing heading into an economy with institutionalized innovative structures. The state intervention driving economic policies, development of ICT infrastructure and skilled labor, as well as strategies taking advantage of global dynamics of the time, created possibilities for innovation. Such linkages for innovation propelled South Korea's capacity and development in areas of new generation technologies such as 5G. ASEAN's own linkages for KBE was a story that began in late 1990s with ASEAN member states such as Malaysia announcing the KBE master plan in 2002. At the ASEAN level, the Committee on Science and Technology existed since 1970 and has since spoke on things like public-private collaborations, talent mobility, people-to-people connectivity, inclusiveness, enterprise support, and public awareness. However, development levels still vary. In 2019, in the Global Competitiveness Index, Singapore ranked first, while Laos is actually is developing at 113 out of 141 countries, while Myanmar was not placed. Technologies such as 5G will be the catalyst for new developments to occur. With a larger bandwidth and computing power technologies such as 5G would open possibilities for AI and for the promises for countries to actually leapfrog in terms of development. However, could ASEAN actually close the gap as countries capable of innovate better, while countries who incorporate technologies do so with only the available safeguards at their mercy? The development and implementation of 5G actually presents an interesting case study when it comes to the capability of nations to develop based on taxi knowledge. As we would be aware of the headlines, 5G is an area of competition in Southeast Asia. We are familiar with names associated with 5G, such as Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia. Huawei provides the equipment for Globe Telecom in the Philippines and Cambodia, while partnerships with Malaysia's Maxis and Axiata Group and trials in Malaysia, Cambodia, and Myanmar demonstrates the innovative capacities. Comparatively, Ericsson's strategy focuses on 5G trials, such as 4G bases to be upgraded into 5G network-ready infrastructures. Nokia actually focuses a little bit more on products ranging from radio, core, optical to digital technologies while conducting trials in Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia. South Korea's 5G focus has been domestic, despite renowned expertise in radio access network business, dynamic random access memory, and the NAND market. Asset managing firms such as Eastspring Investments have highlighted South Korea's role as handset makers and test beds for 5G cloud gaming. However, approaches in ASEAN member states are limited. South Korea's SK Telecom has a strategic partnership with Now Corporation, a B2B solutions provider in Philippines, to build 5G standalone commercialization infrastructure. In addition to drawing a roadmap for 5G services, design infrastructures, and provide education on core 5G technologies. Also present are South Korea's partnerships in displaying 5G use cases, such as what was conducted in Indonesia, as well as roaming tests conducted for Vietnam telcos. A worthwhile approach would be, as domestic nations try to adopt indigenous ways of increasing their technological capacities. For instance, Vietnam's insistence on developing indigenous capacity when it comes to 5G. So Vietnam's approach to 5G are where partnerships with South Korea works to build domestic capacity. Vietnam's Ministry of Information and Communications mentioned in 2020 that further cooperation can be developed for research and the production of Vietnamese 5G equipment. As such, these such capacities to actually build big technological and innovative centers was actually reflected in last year's ASEAN-ROK commemorative summit. And these are perhaps one of the ways that the granular ways that it can actually consider ways forward. But however, as we actually move some of the conversations forward, not forgetting some of the possibilities for the rules-based order, South Korea and ASEAN, actually through involvement in the United Nations, have indicated interest in taking practical steps to implement norms of cybersecurity. For instance, in upholding the norm of cooperation in the case of a cyber incident, South Korea proposed a minimum requirement of providing qualified information, including such indicators of compromise, such as internet protocol, location of perpetrators, and computers used for malicious ICT acts. As such ways, there are actually various ways to engage in regards to cybersecurity and cyber preparation. I'm actually going to stop the presentation here, and we can actually just focus a little more on Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Marlena. So now we will have the discussants to discuss whether they want to raise the point about what the panelists have mentioned or the book that they have already read. So first up, we will have Dr. Lee Jae-hyun, please.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Actually, it's past 12 o'clock in Seoul. It's 12:38 or something, so it's afternoon in Seoul. And I first have to say that I'm so much honored to be a part of this conference launching this great book on New Southern policy. And on top of that, I'm very glad to catch up with my ISIS friends there. Stephen, Chuping, and Farlina on the stage. I miss you guys so much. Well, first of all, the congratulations on the ISIS Malaysia, Korea Foundation, and all authors of this book. You made such a great effort to publish this book. As a discussant, I have three keywords today and one question. I'm not quite sure if I have enough time to go through all this, but anyway, the first keyword that I have today is shame. I'm not ashamed of you guys, but I'm ashamed of myself. Seriously, I believe this is the kind of first English book on New Southern policy, and it is published by ISIS Malaysia, not by South Korean scholars. I myself have been following up this topic of New Southern policy for 3 years, and I produced a couple of articles in Korean and in English, but I never dreamed of publishing a book. And it actually shows the kind of limits that South Korean community of ASEAN studies have. We don't have enough number of people. We don't have enough knowledge of Southeast Asia, and we don't have enough number of people who are actually interested in the policy issues. So that is why probably we cannot publish this kind of book first in South Korea. So this is also the point that there's another point that I want to make, a kind of a recommendation for New Southern policy. I mean, the New Southern policy is doing a great job in Southeast Asia, but it also has to look domestic front, South Korea, and the government. To promote New Southern policy, it has to make more effort to promote ASEAN studies within South Korea. That is one of the points that make Korea-ASEAN relations deeper. That's the first point. And the second point is middle power issue. I kind of liked a chapter by Miss Frances Cruz, and there's one particular sentence I really liked. I quote, "There is the question of how South Korea can differentiate itself from other powers and how its middle powermanship can be expressed beyond trade, cultural exchange, and capacity building to avoid South Korea punching below its weight in terms of middle power potential. And actually, Ms. Cruz made this point in her presentation. I also made this point for a few years, traveling around Southeast Asia to herald, if you like, New Southern policy in Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. I made this point quite a number of times. Maybe I'm traveling too much, so that's why I don't have enough time to write a book on New Southern policy. But anyway, South Korea's New Southern policy and South Korea's policy toward Southeast Asia so far have done a great job in promoting social cultural cooperation, economic cooperation. Well done. But on political, security, and strategic front, the performance is less than I expected. These topics, political cooperation, security, and strategic cooperation, always have been put at the back burner. It's understandable given South Korea's security situation like Korean Peninsula, and to manage peninsula situation, we have to mind our relations with the 4 major powers surrounding Korean Peninsula. But it should not continue to be so in the coming years. And when it comes to security and strategic cooperation, I'm not talking about kind of projecting South Korea's power to Southeast Asia. That's superpowers kind of a job. What I mean by security and strategic cooperation is what South Korea and ASEAN countries can do together in turbulent regional security, strategic, and economic environment to extend, to promote our own interest, Korea's and ASEAN countries' interest, and to shape a regional order beneficial for these small and medium countries in the region. That's the second point. And the third point, a keyword is North Korea. There are excellent chapters in this book on on ASEAN and North Korea relations. If I summarize those arguments, that basically it is about ASEAN's comparative advantage in approaching North Korea and in dealing with Korean Peninsula issue. This is quite similar to my argument. I have made this argument quite a number of times in Korea and Southeast Asia. South Korea's successful New Southern policy can be translated into ASEAN-Korea joint application of this 3P principle and the Korean Peninsula issue and opening up North Korea. So like, people addressing human security and governance issues in North Korea, prosperity, of course, the economic opening up and growth of North Korea, and peace, so bringing North Korea to regional platforms of cooperation and to the international community. So we can make a joint effort to apply this New Southern policies, 3P principle, into the North Korea and to the Korean Peninsula. But there's a question I would like to ask to Korean government and Korean society in general. The first question is if South Korea is ready to seek ASEAN's proactive role in Korean Peninsula and in North Korean issue. And the second question is how much South Korea is concerned with ASEAN security issues in return for ASEAN's involvement in Korean Peninsula issue and North Korea. And the last point, a very short question. The Ambassador Lee mentioned a kind of new Korean government plan on making platform between Korea and maritime Southeast Asian countries. And of course, the Mekong is already established concept, so we can have Korea-Mekong summit and cooperation. But how you guys in stage and in the in floor think of this new idea of building maritime Southeast Asia and Korea cooperation platform on top of Korea, ASEAN, and Korea individual countries cooperation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee Jae-hyun. A very comprehensive overview of what the speakers has talked about and also touch upon the other parts of the book. So next we have Professor Andrew Yong. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
I wanted to say good morning, and let me just begin by congratulating Dr. Hu Chu-ping and her collaborators, also ISIS Malaysia, and also the Korea Foundation for supporting this important project. While the day-to-day affairs of ASEAN-ROK relations are driven by policymakers, business leaders, and members of civil society, scholars and analysts like Dr. Hu play an important role in helping all stakeholders better understand this developing relationship. It's important to periodically take stock of where ASEAN-ROK relations has come from, how it's doing at present, and where it's heading into the future. The last major stock-taking effort took place 5 years ago in a volume published by the Korean Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, commemorating 25 years of ASEAN-ROK cooperation. Since then, the most significant development to take place has been the New Southern Policy. To that end, this book offers a much-needed update and assessment on new developments and challenges to ASEAN-ROK relations, including in the areas of cybersecurity, maritime cooperation, and North Korea policy, the latter which took on increasing significance following the Singapore and Hanoi summits. For anyone interested in the New Southern Policy, especially from the vantage point of ASEAN member states, this volume is a must-read. But in the interest of time, let me just raise 3 problems, not only for the volume editor and her contributors, but anyone who cares about the future of ASEAN-ROK cooperation. So I want to give some comments overall to the book, and then I do have some specific comments to the other panelists in their individual book chapters, but we'll see how much time we have. So the moderators can feel free to cut me off if we're going past time. Okay, so what are some problems that might be raised from this book? The first is that I think more systematic attention needs to be given to a dual-track regional and bilateral approach to ASEAN. So several contributors, most notably Mr. Dr. Stephen Wang, briefly addressed this point. But what I want to raise is how much intentionality is there among ASEAN and South Korean counterparts in creating a mutual reinforcing bilateral, multilateral nexus in support of the NSP and ASEAN-ROK relations. And so this is something that Dr. Hu raises in the conclusion, but I think within the individual chapters, even though there is discussion of bilateral cooperation, there doesn't seem to be a framework for integrating the bilateral and multilateral aspects of ASEAN-ROK cooperation. And the question I want to raise is it possible that ASEAN-ROK cooperation is fundamentally being driven more by separate bilateral relationships? So the South Korea-Vietnam relationship, or South Korea-Indonesia cooperation, South Korea-Malaysia cooperation. So if that's the case, would this be a problem for the New Southern Policy, which tends to assume that South Korea deals with a unified, integrated ASEAN? While there are strong diplomatic reasons for South Korea to treat ASEAN as a unitary partner, in practice, South Korea already recognizes that its priority and initiatives in Southeast Asia requires disaggregation, whether at the bilateral level, or perhaps at the sub-regional level, such as projects involving the Mekong area. So again, this bilateral multilateral nexus, it might be seen as something as ad hoc, but I wonder if South Korea and ASEAN member states can pursue bilateral cooperation from the start as a broader part of New Southern Policy. And so again, raises this question about intentionality in bilateral relations to support NSP. Okay, so the second problem I want to raise has to do with the vantage or perspectives or the vantage point of where we see the NSP. So there seems to be a heavier responsibility on South Korea to drive the NSP forward since it was initiated by the South Korean government. But what can ASEAN or ASEAN member states do specifically to also help institutionalize the NSP, especially if ASEAN member states are seen as a partner among equals? So of course, this is a two-way form of cooperation. There has to be contribution from both sides, but because NSP is a South Korean, it was initiated by South Korea, sometimes it seems like the onus is very much on the Moon government or on South Korea to ensure that this framework sticks around. But how can ASEAN countries be contributing to that process? Not just ASEAN-ROK cooperation broadly, but specifically the New Southern Policy. And the last problem or question that I'll raise is the question of India and where does India fit in this picture? And granted, this book is focused on ASEAN-South Korea cooperation as stated in the subtitle. But given that the main title is New Southern Policy and India is also a part of that policy, I was wondering if there shouldn't have been some kind of discussion on how India fits into this picture. And it also raises a broader question for NSP, South Korean officials as they think about NSP moving forward, of how we fit, is the Southern policy, is it a separate policy for Southeast Asian ASEAN and another one for India? How do we integrate India into ASEAN-ROK cooperation, the New Southern Policy? And there wasn't really that much attention to that, or it wasn't really addressed in any substantive way within the volume. If I may, I can just give a few comments to some of the other panelists here this morning. And I thought that overall, again, the chapters were very thought-provoking. It made me certainly think about the ASEAN-ROK relationship. But I'll begin with Dr. Francis Cruz's chapter on soft and middle, on soft power, diplomacy and the middle power status of South Korea. So I'll agree that Korea is a middle power, and yes, South Korea carries a cachet of soft power, but the connection between these two things is unclear. Middle power status, which I see as an end, and soft power, which is a means, are not always correlated in a straightforward way. South Korea's middle power status, to me at least, rests on its material capabilities. South Korea is the 12th largest economy. It's the 10th biggest spender on a military. So something like K-pop or K-dramas, Korean culture, how do they matter? Or do they matter because South Korea possesses such capabilities? Or do they create an independent effect on their own? So it's a question of South Korea's middle power status and where the soft power fits into that picture. And I'll just raise, one of my colleagues, Jean Franco at UP Diliman, she wrote a short piece a few months ago about this gap between the tremendous popularity of K-drama and K-pop in the Philippines, but only lukewarm attitudes towards South Korea as a country. So again, there seems to be a mismatch between the popularity of K-pop and K-drama and what that actually translates to. So it'd be interesting if Dr. Cruz can maybe elaborate a bit more on the relationship between middle power status and soft power. So Mr. Dr. Steve Wong's chapter on the economics of the New Southern Policy, this was actually one of my favorite chapters, and I thought it was one of the strongest chapters because it asked the hard questions about the New Southern Policy. I mean, it's very easy to get caught up in the rhetoric and flowery language of the ASEAN unity and the ASEAN community, and I think Mr. Wong, much like his presentation, just gets right to the point. And this is why I think the why questions are also very important. What is this for and where are we going? with the NSP before we get to the how questions. And I want to say just one specific comment towards the end. He mentioned the New Southern Policy and the Korean New Deal. And it's his example, it's a specific example he offers of connecting the New Southern Policy to South Korean domestic initiatives. In this case, to stimulate the South Korean economy in a post-COVID environment. And this is very much like the Belt and Road Initiative, with China linking its Belt and Road strategy to its domestic economic policy. And I think this is one way where, if you're thinking about institutionalizing New Southern policy, thinking about domestic politics is the angle to go. It's a point that Dr. Lee had also raised. And finally, with Ms. Farlena Saeed's chapter on technologies and cybersecurity, again, I thought this was an important addition to the discussion on NSP, especially with all the concerns about technology, communications, and the future of the internet. There's significant opportunities for ASEAN-ROK cooperation in the technology realm, especially with 5G and the Internet of Things. But South Korea isn't the only player. And as Ms. Saeed mentions, there's also Huawei and Nokia. But in regards to the New Southern Policy, I would encourage her and others to think a bit harder on the geopolitical implications of Korean cooperation with ASEAN member states on 5G. Would such moves be perceived as benign by China? What are the strategic implications of cybersecurity cooperation? And is it possible for ASEAN states to first establish a standard for 5G cooperation amongst themselves, which they could then apply when partnering with different partnering with different companies, whether it be Samsung, LG, Nokia, or Huawei? So again, it's this idea of, we're dealing with technology and 5G, but in making certain choices, could they possibly trigger other geopolitical implications? So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the Q&A like everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Andrew. So I think we have very strong discussions here. So, and I also think that Dr. Lee Jae-hyun is being overly humble about the first New Southern Policy book in English. Actually, Sejong Institute, another think tank in South Korea, has published, in which Dr. Stephen Wong has contributed a chapter as well on middle power. So that book actually focused only on the middle power aspect of New Southern Policy. So admittedly, this book is more comprehensive and covering many different themes of the issues concerning ASEAN and South Korea. So I would like to invite our speakers to respond to the very hard questions posed by the discussion. And if I may rephrase, so each of you, I think we would go to in the reverse. So you may respond to Professor Andrew's question first. So Francis, you respond on the soft power. So does soft power such as the K-pop dimension matter compared to the security dimension? Please, Francis.
This is referring to the question of Dr. Yo.
Yeah,
right? Sorry, I missed it. Okay. This is precisely what troubles me, because when operationalized, you look at the indices that have been put out for middle powers and soft powers, and it's true that a middle power seems to be kind of an end, and soft power is a means to achieve an end. And I completely agree with Dr. Dato Wong that there is this question of why. I kind of touch on it. I can't really articulate why there is this cooperation, but what I do see in both Southeast Asia and India is that they represent markets. There are lots of people who live in Southeast Asia and India who have shown in recent years or in recent decades a great deal of interest in South Korea. And I do think that very economic power is actually not very easy to classify in terms of soft power. Some people call it different names, right? So there's a lot of debate about how you classify economic aspects of power, whether they're soft and not exactly hard or somewhere in between, or if they're sticky, and this whole entire debate. What I do notice is that the indices tend to mirror each other. They're looking at similar data in order to operationalize what a middle power behavior should be and what soft power is. And what these have in common, as I mentioned, I think earlier, was diplomacy, indices for culture and economic exchange. And I do think that, if I may caution a guess, that the success of this pop culture, and I think that Dr. Franco pointed that out quite correctly, is that there is a lot of success, and it has led to some effects in tourism. It has led to a bit of interest. It has led to an increase in foreign students who are coming into Korea, and I think that there is some kind of mutual benefit there. Learnings between both countries, also the rankings increase. Whether or not this is part of a larger architecture of a vision of the new order, or a Korean initiated vision of what order should look like in Southeast Asia is less clear. Although I do think that through these gains, which are, I also do mention that in the chapter, that it's not all positive in terms of K-pop, etc. There has been backlash from individual governments that have talked about cultural imperialism, for example, but that was quite some time ago, and it's different depending on which state you look at Southeast Asia. That how can that be channeled into something more comprehensive? And I think that the production maybe of things like cell phones, technology, green growth, these are things that are actually more concrete and that can be more easily linked to soft power means than what is going on right now, because there is a disjuncture. So this is a lot of soft power is being driven by private firms and companies with maybe government subsidies, but that's very kind of indirect. At the same time, they're very much linked to consumer technology, the digital world, which has its own kind of power. And I do think that other countries who have been involved in, let's say, green growth or green initiatives or certain NGO projects across Southeast Asia have been received quite favorably. And I think South Korea might want to look at how that works with these different countries. But I do mention in the chapter that there is possibility, because I do think that by looking at NSP's goals, they want green growth, for example. And I do try to assert that may be kind of area for niche diplomacy. However, you can't speak about green growth and then be the producer of gas-guzzling cars, not do anything about the environment in Southeast Asia, or realize, let's say, the plastics that are produced by consumer electronics, consumer goods, beauty products, etc., which are all linked into this like wider market that South Korea wishes to seek in Southeast Asia. So I do think that there is an opportunity to kind of combine maybe non-traditional security or human security or disaster management, that kind of thing, or green growth with soft power initiatives. There is a way to do it, I think. But however, I don't really know if the strategy is clear or if it goes towards that direction, because it seems counterproductive almost. So yes, I think that's a great point, and I do think that ought to be part of a greater strategy of the why, precisely, because it is a gain. I do think that there have been gains in certain aspects of the Korean economy, but whether or not this is tied in with security or a vision of regional human security is less clear.
Thank you so much, Francis. Yeah, so that's a very great response as well. So next, so I would like to jump the queue a bit on to Falina, actually. So on the strategic implications of cyber cooperation, and relate to how Dr. Lee Jae-hyun illustrates about the middle power geopolitical context of today's world. So how does that position South Korea's power in Southeast Asia in terms of cyber?
I think, hello. I think something interesting about cyber is that it actually involves various players, inclusive of, say, the private sector. You actually have the hardware aspect of it, as well. You actually have the software aspect of it. So when you actually see the partnerships that have materialized, it actually happens to be more in the hardware, say if you would actually share different types of, if you would actually invest in certain capabilities, for instance, when I actually mentioned 5G, you actually talk about developing certain aspects of the 5G infrastructure and actually to unpack that and to actually build that back to, so that you can actually prepare so that the nation themselves can actually understand how these technologies work. So because of the multifaceted dimension of technologies, the fortification or resilience actually comes from being able to enable these nations to unpack and be able to repack the technologies by themselves. Some of the examples that was referred to when we actually look at things like innovation, for instance, the example that they gave on China, there's the example of you can innovate from 0 to n and then from n to 1. So in that sense, you can actually start from n going to 1, and you can actually learn how to reverse engineer n going to 0. And this whole innovative structure that is based on knowledge, retaining knowledge, actually prepares nations for the better future. So back to the idea about geopolitics and how do nations actually get out of the trap where you actually stuck being the technology consumer as opposed to being able to prepare your systems to understand better. The capacity building actually comes from the technical aspects, which is actually the innovative aspect. It also comes from being able to ensure your legal and regulative structures and frameworks are prepared to deal with any future issues. And these actually comes from digital forensics, being able to highlight your ICT problems. I hope that actually answers the question.
All right, so Dr. Stephen Wong, so I would like you to address Professor Andrew Yaw's question to you specifically, and also maybe throw in a bit about India. So do we really want India to be part of the ASEAN-ROK trade economic arrangement?
Let me say just two comments which mostly relate to what Andrew has said. First, I think, is the fact that the NSP operates on 2 levels. I don't know whether it operates on the 3 levels. Level 1 is the diplomatic and political. That is a given, all right? That has been launched and it will come to an end. The second is what happens under that, the bilateral. This is on economic development projects that happen or don't happen. Okay, this is also relates to overseas direct investment in the sort of countries. The third element is that which I'm not sure, I don't know, there's been nothing mentioned really in all of this, and that's the security dimension. Okay, this one there, I guess, by its very nature, will not, feature in sort of big things, because security has to be done in closed rooms, not in the, not in the open. Now, on his issue that we're not talking about ASEAN per se, I would argue that the reality is that even today, South Korea-ASEAN relationship is already differentiated. When we quote a figure of 160 billion, 200 billion, it is not. I mean, if you take out, for example, Vietnam, Korea out of that equation, you will find that it actually drops a lot. If you take out Singapore, it drops even more. And if you take out Malaysia, all right? So it is already runs on pragmatics. These pragmatics were not, you can say, it was assisted by the 2010 ASEAN-Korea Free Trade Area and the efforts that have been made since 2010 to deepen. But a lot of this is, Lotte Chemicals, for example, is bought a Malaysian company and its main plant is now in Indonesia. And this is the big plant to supply, ASEAN sort of countries. It was originally a Malaysian company, but the Malaysian company started, this plant in Indonesia, and now it's all owned by Lotte Chemicals. It's those kinds of things that will go on, and I can't see it being any other way. Now, on top of this, can ASEAN still have a united approach and say, yes, this is part and parcel of NSP? The realities, I think, are fast becoming clear to the people in Seoul that this is how it has to be. Let me say one very quick thing. The Japanese government and even the Chinese government, when they first approached ASEAN, they had the same kind of naive thing that ASEAN is, you deal with one, you deal with all right? The Japanese have now realized, and China, when they were negotiating the ASEAN-China FTA, they were astounded that you actually had to have bilateral, FTAs with each of the individual ASEAN countries. So it has always been like that, but we put the cover of ASEAN unity, okay? So those are my two responses. I would like to ask Jae-hyun actually two questions. First question is, can you tell us, Jae, what is the Presidential Committee on the NSP up to these days? Because I understand that the number of projects is now 100 or so. It's been increasing and increasing. I don't know what, very little is actually, we actually get on the Presidential Committee on the New Southern Policy. The second question is, in 2 years' time, President Moon will step down and pass. How do you see this NSP component actually concluding in the 5 years? And of course, it will continue. But what do ASEAN countries? How can ASEAN countries expect that in the 5th year, all right, something will come up? A declaration, another summit, or something on the NSP.
So the roles reversal. So the questions are for you, Dr. Lee Jae-hyun.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and all the answers. Yeah, this is quite difficult question to answer, because Stephen, you asked me two questions. First about the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy. I'm just a humble, a scholar. Although I'm giving consultation to this committee, I don't know what's exactly going on inside this committee, because I'm not part of the government. But as far as I know, the committee is preparing the next step of a New Southern Policy. You just mentioned the New Southern Policy has more than 100 projects between Korea and Southeast Asian countries, you mentioned, right? And then the next step should be obviously kind of, sorting out all these projects. And then we have to focus on the specific areas of cooperation. We cannot, deal with all this and put them under banners, like, grouping or categorization. Then maybe this kind of job is being done in the committee, and I'm quite sure that one of the main focus of New Southern Policy being drawn by the Presidential Committee is on the health cooperation and during the COVID-19 area. But honestly, I don't have the insight on what is going on there. The second question is also difficult. I don't have the crystal ball to to see the future. What could be the kind of the last events or milestone achievement or some of New Southern Policy? I'm not quite sure. But you have to ask a political question, domestic politics here. At the end of this government, at the end of this Moon Jae-in government, is the president still popular with the people? Then there might be something, some kind of big ceremony or signing to commemorate the 5 years of New Southern Policy at the end. But I don't know. I shouldn't make comments on domestic politics. Then the next government, some of you may be wondering if the next government is is going to follow up this new Southern policy or not. And it is totally dependent on Moon Jae-in government. If this government achieves something, not just in Southeast Asia, but domestic front as well, if this government is successful to ingrain the importance of Southeast Asia among the Korean audience, then maybe the Korean people, general public, will demand the next government, hey, you guys, you have to come up with some kind of policy initiative towards Southeast Asia. Then one of my criteria to assess the success of the New Southern policy at the end of the day is if the Moon Jae-in government was successful to put that kind of consciousness, to put that kind of perception among the Korean general public. Actually, I had one comment on among your answers, but do I have enough time to make a small comment? Sharpen.
Yes.
No?
Yes, no. So because we also, have to look for the time for the Q&A, so I would like to have Nazran to address some of the questions from the chat room.
Hello, did you hear me
Yes.
clearly? Thanks. Firstly, thank you to the panel and discussants for their very in-depth insight and analysis. Right now, we have a question from Mr. Lucio Pitlo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's essentially on the question and topic of the US and China trade war and how Korea might be impacted by it, or what role Korea can play with regards to it. So the question goes as follows. Will the growing US pressure on Huawei and Chinese technology and infrastructure companies provide openings for the South Korean firms, especially in the regional telecommunications or infrastructure landscape? And can South Korean firms like Samsung offer a viable alternative amid the increasing US-China tech decoupling? Adam, that's all for now from Zoom.
I would like to collect the questions from the floor. So if you have any, please raise your hand. Yes, please, Dr. Stephen Leong.
Thank you, Stephen Leong, visiting fellow ISIS Malaysia. I'm very pleased to listen to the explanation and suggestions moving forward for middle power diplomacy. I have a very brief comment and one question. Okay, the comment is that we understand very well indeed that Korea is eminently qualified as a middle power, as other middle powers are available like Australia and so on. And the ingredients, the wherewithal, soft power, areas to focus and so on. But to get things moving, you really need a forum, a platform. And I was very pleased that Professor Stephen Nagy at ICU in Japan came out with a proposal that we've been talking so much about middle power, we must get moving. We should have, he suggested, a group of 10. Now, group 20 arose after the Great Recession. Group 10 consisted middle powers. Then last week, forgotten the name of the author, asking for step. And he reminded us that in 2013, at the General Assembly of the UN, there was a group of 5 middle powers came together, and with the acronym MITKA, M-I-T-K-A, Mexico, India, Turkey, Korea, and Australia. So we do need a forum. Otherwise, it's not going to move at all. We'll be talking and talking about it. Maybe it's too much to talk about, oh, let's have a charter and so on. But we could follow the ASEAN way in having a middle power declaration, just a few pages, to see how we can go literally moving concretely forward. Thank you. Is this possible?
Right, thank you. So I think Falina can address the question first.
Thank you greatly, Mr. Lucio, for actually presenting the question, particularly on the U.S.-China trade wars and possibilities for South Korea. I would actually like to say the short answer would be yes. In the longer run, it may actually be a more questionable feature, and I will actually explain why. In the short term, I think ISES from Singapore have actually launched, they conducted a survey in regards to which nation would ASEAN nations actually prefer when it comes to ICT infrastructure. And then South Korea actually ranked pretty high. But from the responses, it can actually be mentioned that these, it is actually not equal, it is not an approach that's actually the same for all the Southeast Asian nations. And I think that would actually be the difficulty when it comes to different ASEAN member state actually has specific partnerships that they would prefer. And this is the space which South Korea actually has to contest in. The good part is that South Korea is actually still quite domestic when it came to 5G interaction, 5G promotion for other nations. But while it actually presents that's actually an opportunity as well as a risk, in the sense that it would actually be a possibility to see where the South Korea would actually be able to fit and would be able to offer in regards to the technologies. I think that would be.
Thank you. So on the soft power, do they need any platform? And the ASEAN-ROK already has one. So perhaps we will have Ms. Francis Cruz to address this question.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I don't work in the government, so I really can't say talk about the possibility of that actually happening, or even from a Philippine perspective. But certainly, there has been. It was on a slide that a recognition of a middle power in that sense. In 2013, there was this MICTA gathering of middle powers. And that was under the previous administration, although what is a little bit strange about it is that they were reluctant to acknowledge specifically a middle power role. So there was not much rhetoric about it, and yet there was participation in this one particular platform for middle power initiatives. I do think there is a lot of potential, although I don't seem to be hearing about the activities of this group in very lately or recently, and I'm not really quite sure why. The question, of course, is the sustainability of this throughout administrations, whether or not it can be sustained, and what goals they may have for cooperation, which would be something to look into. If there's sustainability, if there's coordination, and if they present a different sort of vision for order or for cooperation, because like I said before, there's lots of potential in non-traditional security and development. I do think that is something quite concrete, without naming the specifics yet, that middle powers can help with. To different degrees, the security architecture as well, I think it will largely depend on priorities and whether or not they believe that is a good thing for their own states to come up with something strategic for security, or whether or not multilateralism is something that they wish to pursue. Another factor we have to look into today, I think, in a world where there are many middle powers, is that there is a lot of flexibility that's needed. So there was a suggestion to look at principles rather than specific goals. And if there are specific goals, then at least have a way to measure them, and a way to say whether or not they have been achieved. So this question of why, what, how, what can be achieved, I think these are all very legitimate questions, regardless of whether or not there is a platform. So in what direction do we want to go in? Do we want to continue addressing these transnational issues, development issues, climate change related issues, health issues, which are all interconnected? They're also connected with the economy, for example, or do we really want to go into non-traditional mode in terms of the traditional middle powers and non-traditional middle powers and present an alternative to a liberal world order? I don't think that these are questions that can simply be ignored at this level. So sure, I mean, a platform can occur, and I do think that there are other things that are going on, like that are more security related, like the Quad, for example, and although that's not really exactly middle power cooperation specifically, but more importantly is what the role is of these platforms and what they wish to achieve, whether or not there should be real targets or more of strategies, of principles, or if it's really transformative in nature. And if they're sustainable as well, or if they ought to be sustainable beyond some point. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. As for its possibility, like I said, I'm not a practitioner, so I don't quite know.
We appreciate your scholarly opinions and response to this. And I think this panel has asked many hard questions. And actually, the first part of the book, if you read it, it really poses difficult questions as to how much, to what extent we are interconnected and indispensable to each other. So what the panelists and also the discussant has raised are actually answering to each other. So when Andrew mentioned that are we going too heavy on the bilateral exchanges rather than the multilateral? But ASEAN-ROK is one set of the relations where there are action plans and they are actually implementing it with the ROK ASEAN chair, which is held by Brunei, overseeing the process. And in terms of soft power, so South Korea itself has been asking themselves for many years, how are they going to translate their formidable soft power into political influence? So I think that question about whether we have a platform to do so is something for New Southern Policy 2.0 to ponder upon and to carry out. So I think cyber connectivity is something that we cannot avoid, especially in the post-pandemic context. And this afternoon, our session will focus exactly on this theme. And thank you so much for staying with us. And we are wrapping up our panel sessions right on time. And please give a big hands and applause to all of our panelists and also discussants. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hu and all role players. That concludes the first half of today's proceedings. May I please now invite everyone for lunch at Serena Brasserie at lobby level. For our Muslim participants who might want to perform Zohor prayers, the surau is located at level 5. But please note that due to the COVID-19 standard operating procedures, you will be required to bring your own prayer outfits and prayer mats. Proceedings will resume at 2 p.m. Malaysia time. Thank you.